You're listening to Surkeus Records, the podcast. Season 3, Episode 2, featuring Andy Brown. Here we go. Okay, welcome back. You're listening to Surkeus Records, the podcast, Season 3, Episode 2. Today, our guest is founder of Conundrum Press, a publisher of literary graphic novels that got their start in 1996 and is still going strong. Andy Brown is with us today. Andy, thanks for taking the time to come and chat tonight.
Thank you. Hello. Thanks for having me.
Andy, if you don't mind, start from the beginning. Like, how did you get into this specific line of work? Where did this all originate from?
Yeah. So, well, yes, I've been asked this question a lot, obviously. I describe it by saying Conundrum Press is very much a product of a time and place. And the time was post-referendum Montreal, so 1996. So there was a referendum in 1995, which was to Quebec to separate from Canada. And it was only 0.5% difference. So it literally was almost that Quebec left Canada. So a lot of English, I'm Anglophone. I come from Vancouver. So I was living in Montreal, just going to school and enjoying the cosmopolitanness of it. I mean, the French part of it was one of the reasons I was there. So a lot of the English businesses left, taking all the money. All the support for English arts was gone if it had ever started. All the buildings were vacant. So a lot of, as is the case often with Bohemian communities, throughout time, this vacant space, artists move in. Constellation Records started up, Drawn and Quarterly started up, I started up. There was a big spoken word scene, Godspeed You Black Emperor, like all of this started happening. A lot of writers. So I was a writer. I was writing novels and short stories, and so I was getting involved in that community. But all of it was so mixed because it was kind of just like underground. So it was French, English, music, poetry, visual arts, everything was mixed together, zines, comics. So I just thought it was fantastic. I mean, we were all completely broke, but, we're in our 20s and, that wasn't as big a deal at the time. So, but it was really, really cheap to live. So it was possible to get by. And I freelanced a lot and I did my writing. So then I started just as part of my art, I'm going to say artistic practice. I think that's a pretty pretentious way of saying it, but just like the urge to create, I guess. Started making little books of my writing and drawing and taking photographs and assembling them. And I didn't know what to do with them, but I just thought they were cool. I'd pass them around to people at events or whatever. And then other people were like, oh, can you do this for me? And I'm like, I guess. Okay. And so I did, oh, can we have a launch? And well, you can make them and sell them for $10. I'm like, okay, I guess. And, oh, can we have Godspeed You Black Emperor play? And can we do this and have a band? And it's like, okay. So then, I did a lot of organizing, but it was a lot of help and people around in the community that just wanted to keep it going. So that went on for about 15 years. Obviously, after the referendum, things got better and things changed and, had kids and people started having children and moving and getting kicked out because of gentrification, et cetera, et cetera. So at one point, 15 years in, I decided in 2010 that I kind of needed to focus a bit more. So I had been publishing a lot of comics and graphic novels. One of the reasons I got really into that was the underground Francophone community. So coming from Montreal, I'd read Tintin and Asterix maybe, and, superhero comics and that sort of thing. I had no idea this stuff existed. It was completely blew my mind. And, I was actually meeting some of these artists and going to these events, and I can remember a couple events I went to. I was just awestruck at like how cool all this was, and the type of work they were producing was just like, wow, this is insane. So that kind of pushed me all into graphic novels and alternative comics. plus I was seeing what was coming out in the U.S. People like Dan Clowes and Charles Burns and Peter Bagg and alternative comics there, which is all like post underground, like Robert Crumb and all that was in the 60s. So it's kind of riffing off that. But the thing about Montreal is it has this huge francophone influence from France, where bande dessinée is bigger than fiction. Basically, it's huge. So there was a lot of crossover. So I mostly, to make a long story short, started doing more. I decided, okay, I'm just going to do graphic novels. And so that's what I did. So the last 10 years, that's all I've been doing. And every year it kind of grew, and I got a bit more grants, a bit more sales, a bit better distribution. And it's 27 years later, and I'm still doing it. So
how would you describe the like present day operations of Conundrum Press? What is it exactly that you guys are doing right now? What's do you provide services? Is it more just like a product based business? What are your operations consisting of? Right
well, it's pretty much a traditional publishing house. What a traditional publishing house would do. It's a smaller scale than many, I guess, but that also means we can operate, in the nooks and crannies and but also in the mainstream. So what I would do, like, so until the last couple years ago, I hired a marketing manager, who's in head of St. Margaret's Bay, but up until then it was just me. So for at least 22 years. So basically I was doing all the accounting, all the marketing, setting up the events, doing all the design, all the production, all the editing, all of everything. Basically driving to events with boxes in my car. And the only thing I wouldn't do is the actual printing itself, because I don't have a printing press. So I would send those off. So by the time I started doing it, it was digital. It was just barely digital. So that another advantage of starting in 1996 was Apple came out with the desktop laser printer, and personal computers were just basically starting. Email didn't exist yet. It was just starting, but you could use Quark Express, which was an early version of InDesign, assemble a book in Quark Express and give it to a printer who would take it, and then you get a box of books back. A few years before that, and I know people who did graphic design degrees, it would all be paste up. So it'd all be physical stuff that you're literally pasting onto sheets of paper, and there's nothing digital about it. So that was another reason I was able to do this by myself, because, and I had to teach myself all that stuff. I'm not exactly skilled at design and stuff. So I basically taught myself how to do all that. So I would do everything. So I go out and find creators, and some creators more than others, I would help with their projects. Most creators have pretty much come like with a finished product to me. But there's people I work with all the time that I kind of help along the way. And then, we'd have a contract, they keep their rights. And I make the book for them, and I distribute it through my distribution channels, which is now global, and to bookstores and comic shops and book fairs. And then we try to have a launch or something, a few events, and that's pretty much it. So I do everything other than the printing and the creation of the object itself, I guess.
I think that's pretty amazing. Like, you guys are doing some really great stuff. I wanted to get you to comment on this sort of comparison that I thought of. Like, the music industry is, I guess you could call it somewhat of a saturated market, even in Canada with the small population that we have. How many other publishers are there doing what Conundrum Press does here in Canada? Or are you guys essentially like leading the way for literary graphic novels?
Well, I can tell you exactly how many. It's also divided by language, right? So in English, there's about 140 publishers that would operate on a model where they would be getting, like, they're small enough that they'd be getting grants through the Canada Council for the Arts. Thank you very much. Props to Canada Council for the Arts. So it's about 120, something like that. So that, like, poetry presses, fiction presses, people like me, Everything not like academic. Some academic, I guess, like McGill Queens, that sort of thing, but not like great big publishers that are owned by multinationals. Like have to be Canadian. And on the French side, there's about 80 or 90, and then out of those 120, there's probably 3 or 4 that do what I do, that are all graphic novels on the English side. But on the French side, there's probably about 8 or 9.
Okay. No, because you'd mentioned last time we talked about being in, was it Europe somewhere was it Finland or Denmark or something?
I was in Helsinki, yeah.
Where really you were the only Canadian press represented.
Oh, yeah. I've often, yeah. So one of the advantages of switching to graphic novels, it's a much smaller niche. So, and the other thing is like Drawn and Quarterly, who started at the same time in Montreal, is actually one of the largest in the world in terms of reputation. They're not like physically large, but they probably have a staff of like 20, 25 people, and they're publishing people from all over. So, they're kind of on a different level, and I'm kind of like the farm team, I guess, or whatever. So that's one of the presses. And then there's maybe 2 or 3 that are kind of my size. Or maybe not even, I don't know. The Renegade, I guess. And most of them do other, like Arsenal Pulp would do fiction. They do other things as well as graphic novels. So there's very few dedicated specifically to graphic novels. And what I do is literary graphic novels to separate, because graphic novels could be manga, they could be, superheroes, right? So I don't do any of that shit.
So yeah, explain what adding the word literary to the graphic novel. What
I always use this example. So you think of a novel, the word novel, right? So what's a novel? Well, okay, Harlequin Romance is a novel, but so is this super literary work by whoever, Salman Rushdie or something that wins a Nobel Prize. Those are both novels. So I'm on the side of the literary award-winning novel, and the superheroes are on the side of the Harlequin Romance. So as in terms of graphic novels. So if I say I publish graphic novels, the first thing people think of is superheroes or manga, because it's so popular. Manga is just Japanese graphic novels, basically, but it's a very different style. It's also like way massively bigger culturally all over the world than anything else, essentially. So we kind of put that off to the side because that doesn't count. It's too big, basically. Yeah. And because I came out of a writing community and I approach these things as a writer. So, I'm not like, oh, that's the slickest art I've ever seen and that's what I want. No, it's got nothing to do with slick art. In fact, if it's slick art, often it means that there's not much story going on. So I have to kind of balance it. But alternative comics. But, the problem is when you say alternative, people are like, oh, yeah, 90s bands. Like, all of these words are totally loaded. And graphic novel really is a loaded term, too, because that didn't exist till the 80s because people making comics wanted them in bookstores for legitimacy, to be able to sell them better, because the comic industry, comic shops, which is called the direct market, was just so corrupt and it didn't really work. And it was only facilitating, like, how many people go into comic shops? Well, very much comic geeks go into comic shops. So if you're doing something that's quite literary, or you want people to have a sense of, like, its artistic value as an individual mode of expression, let's put it, they're not going into comic shops to find that, right? So calling it a graphic novel gave it a place on a shelf in a bookstore, and things kind of, just rolled on from there, I guess. Did that answer your question?
Absolutely.
Oh, okay.
I feel like it's like from my side here, it's a graphic novel with a more significant form of literary content, as opposed to
that's just a longer way of saying it.
Less focused on entertaining and more on subject matter.
Yeah. Again, the difference between a Harlequin Romance and an award-winning literary book. Like,
no, I think you.
That's
put
really
it very
what
well.
that's really the way I think. Yeah.
I want to go back to what you said a little bit before, starting up in 1996.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about what it was like before the internet, and then how the internet changed things for Conundrum Press at the outset? Like, was there a lot of things you were doing that you had to then change and adjust to?
I can give you a very good example. There's many examples, but this was one that really shocked me. So, I mean, I'm very, like, I don't do social media, so I pay someone to do that. Like, I'm not a guy who's on the internet, you know. I basically just discovered YouTube. Like, it's really, like, I don't know how to do any of this stuff. So when I first started, so 96, late 90s, especially in Montreal, I didn't live anywhere else, so I don't really know, but people tell me it was significant in Montreal. There were poster artists, and posters were the means of letting people know about an event. And part of having an event was to hire someone, some unemployed guy, to go around and wheat paste posters. And there were certain places you knew you could do it, certain places you knew you couldn't do it, certain neighborhoods, you know, you put tape on a lamppost, it's going to come off. So you got to find places to staple. You know, some businesses will rip them down 50 seconds later, you know, so don't bother, you know. So there was this whole postering culture. And then what happened was these guys, many of them comic artists, started silk screening their posters. Some of the more famous ones would be, Mille Poutre, oh God, I've completely blanked on the name, but you'd probably know who they were. But what they were doing were they would make posters for bands, and then the band would come and they would sell they would be able to sell their posters for a lot of money. But they would do it at shows. So the posters would be sold. There was no internet, so they weren't being sold online or anything. And then one day, so we do posters and flyers, right? So you give to people, you go to a party, you pass, hey, I'm having this event, pass out a flyer, boop, 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 whatever. And so people would come to my events, like we'd launch a book or a chapbook or something, and a band would play, and full house, and this is great, and having a great time, good party. Then people stopped coming to these events, and I was just like, oh, well, you know, I'm getting old? Are these books bad? Like, maybe people don't like what I'm doing anymore. And I said to somebody who's a writer, and I was like, who did a lot of events, and I'm just like, what's going on? Like, is people busy? What's happening? He's like, well, are you putting your events on Facebook? I'm like, what's Facebook? And that was right then. Click.
That was
it just moment. Changed. Yeah. That moment everything changed. So that's the real significance. And so then it was like, wow, I have to find, and not through the internet, but I have to find like better distribution, you know, to be in bookstore. Like I have to go more mainstream. Like I can't work as underground as I used to because everyone's moving to this thing called Facebook, right? So, which is kind of laughable now. So that part of it, that changed a lot. And then the posters disappeared. And I mean, that was such a big part of the art of this of the city. And I mean, there still are, and some people are selling them online now and stuff, but which is great because it's a whole art form in itself. I mean, it goes back to Toulouse-Lautrec in the 1880s and all this stuff. But the other thing that the digitization of things, like I couldn't have done what I was doing in 1996, as I mentioned, without a desktop publishing program, and that didn't exist even in like 1992, right? Like, so without that, a guy like me who didn't go to graphic design school, didn't know anything. I was a writer. I would never be able to do any of that. So that was a big difference. People wrote letters, right? I mean, you know, it was a lot of stuff. I constantly am at events with, you know, young artists or people buying books, and I just realized I say something and I realize, oh, right, that was before the internet. Yeah, you wouldn't have any idea what I'm talking about. Yeah. So, yeah, no, but I always use that example of the Facebook events was a paradigm shift, if you want to.
And it just snuck up on you.
Yeah, I didn't know. Yeah.
So it's, from what I'm gathering, it sounds like you're more of a fan of the art form as opposed to, but then you come from a writing background.
Yes, like, which is part of the art form.
For you, what are the components that make up an absolutely excellent graphic novel. Are you more of an art fan, or do you prefer like a more compelling storyline where the art is a little bit dialed back? Like, what's your personal choice?
I am going to put it this way. So graphic novels, so comics, the layout of a comic on a page is a combination of text and image, right? So sometimes that's just like a drawing and someone saying something, so there's text. But you can do all sorts of things with that you can't do in other mediums. So what often is said about comics or graphica or graphic novels, whatever you want to call it, is it's a combination of text and image that work together to make a third thing, right? So for me, it's that third thing that's completely unique to that medium, to that form. And when you find a book that couldn't exist without those two things co-entwined, that's a great piece of literature, right? In that form. It's a great work. I had a writer friend ask me, like, "Oh, can you recommend good graphic novels?" I was trying to suggest things, and they said, "Well, why do you think that one is so great? Or why is that one a masterpiece?" I think I said, "Oh, this one's a masterpiece," which, and there's some serious masterpieces out there. And I said, "Well, I guess the reason this one's a masterpiece, even though it's not the best drawn or the best written, is because it could only exist in this form, and what it's doing with that form is masterful." So that's what I look for. Obviously not everyone makes a masterpiece.
That's a really good way to put it.
But that's how I would put it, yeah.
I don't know much about this genre of art. Does the artwork happen first? Does the story happen first, or is a writer and an artist, coming together and then collaborating, creating a project together? Like, what is the creative process? What does the creative process look like?
Yeah, well, it's different. So certainly in Europe, it's mostly teams. So it's mostly writers who only write for comics, and artists who only draw, like don't ever write their own material, getting together and making something. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. I don't like that. I basically try not to. And then there's like in the kids book world where there's a writer who writes it, presents it to a publisher, and the publisher goes out and finds a quote unquote illustrator, right? Someone who can draw, and puts them together. So it's not a collaboration at all. But with comics, generally it's a collaboration. I mean, there's a lot of writers who come to me and say, "Oh, I have this great idea for a graphic novel. I've written this graphic novel." I'm like, "Okay, great. Can you draw?" And they're like, "Well, no. Can you find me someone who will draw my graphic novel?" And I'd say, "Well, not really, because if you ask someone to spend 2 to 5 years working on your vision, you're going to have to pay them a lot of money." That's the first thing I say. And generally they're like, "Oh yeah, right."
Oh yeah, that takes a while.
And that kind of shuts them up.
They have to draw like 500 pictures. Oh yeah.
Yeah, no, it takes 2 to 5 years. That's how long it takes to draw. So, for my usually what I do, and more in the North American model, is one individual has a vision for something that exists in that form. And what's great is, like, 20 years ago, they would write a poem or make a song or do a painting. Now they think in their head, I could try to do that. I can draw, I can write sort of a little bit of each. Why don't I try that? So and what's really great about it is it's a lot of women. So there's women who basically, adolescent boys is the purview of superhero comics. So women other than Archie aren't really exposed to comics all that much. Not so much anymore in this generation, but previous generations. So for them to say, I want to take this to my own place. I want to try out this form, which I have no baggage in, and see what I can do. And that is the most amazing work comes out of. Women are producing the most amazing comics right now because of that. They have no baggage. They're not coming out of superheroes. A lot of guys are like, they were obsessed with superheroes and like, okay, how can I make that switch into like autobiographical comics or something, right? So It's not quite there, but the women are just kind of coming from a blank slate, right? And they're just like, what can you do? And they're the ones that are doing the best experimental work and stuff. So most of the people that I talk to, they have an idea. It's kind of, it would start out as being written. I mean, they don't just start drawing a panel and go. So they have the idea, and I say, okay, tell me what your book's about in a page. Tell me what your book's about in a paragraph. Tell me what your book's about in a sentence. So they go through that and they figure all that out. So they have the idea. Then they would essentially storyboard it. So what you would do for a movie, right? So you just like little thumbnails, little postage stamp, stick men or women, essentially, with handwritten text. And you go through the whole book that way. Then they say, okay, and they shift things around or cut this out or add this or whatever. And then they have this draft, which is a thumbnail draft, which is still the writing stage, basically. Then they pencil it. So then they actually sit down with a page and they use a pencil and they pencil it all out as well as they can. And they might do the whole book or they might do page by page. That would depend. Like some artists pencil an entire 250-page book and then go back and ink an entire 250-page book. Some people pencil a page and then ink a page and then pencil a page. And then you would ink the page and then erase all the pencil. So the pencil is there you make mistakes. And the ink, you don't make mistakes. And you fill in and you correct. And then you erase all the pencils. So that's why it takes 2 to 5 years to make a graphic novel. So it's a big it's a dedication. And then some people do smaller stories, right? They'll do 10 pages and have a wonderful little story, which works the same way as a short story would in literature. And maybe they collect 5 10-page short stories or whatever it is, or 10 10-page short stories and make a book, which you call a graphic novel, even though it's a collection of stories. But and some people just make like zines and they just start, whipping off zines, which is like drawings and cutting and pasting stuff. And they'll have a zine about their dog. Then they'll have a zine about their favorite kind of coffee. Then they'll have a zine about Bob Dylan, or whatever. Looking at your records. And then they're like, oh, okay, I could just collect, because they're drawing them and writing them and scribbling in them and stuff. It's like, oh, I'll take the best of these zines and I'll collect them and make a book and call it a graphic novel. Or I will. Usually that's where I step in. I say, you could really collect all these zines and put a spine on it and call it a graphic novel. And they're like, I can? Yeah, let's do that. Okay, sure. So that's a lot of books I've done that way too.
So regardless, huge commitment on the artist part.
Oh, huge. Absolutely.
You would know, like, who are some of the top artists in your field in Canada right now that really should be mentioned for people to check out?
Well, okay, I'm gonna get in trouble.
Do like a top 3 or something.
I'm not doing a top anything, but I'll
okay,
give you
just like the first 3 that come to your mind.
Well, the first one that came to my mind is because she's Nova Scotian. She actually is Kate Beaton, who did a web. So her story is she went to Mount Allison in history. Then she started doing then she went out to the oil sands. So she's from Cape Breton. She's from Mabou. She went to the oil sands, worked in the oil sands, started a webcomic. And this webcomic became huge. And it was before people did webcomics. That's another thing people do. Like even like Instagram, just putting panels a day on Instagram. People do that now and then collect them later. That's another thing, another creative way. Anyway, so she did that, and then Drawn and Quarterly, a very respectable publisher, came along, published a couple of her books, very funny. She moved off to New York and stuff. So she just released with Drawn and Quarterly a very thick book called Ducks: 2 Years in the Oil Sands, which is actually on Canada Reads right now. So she moved back to Mabou, and so it's about her time, her 2 or 3 years in the oil sands in Alberta. What's really interesting, I mean, I didn't grow up in the Maritimes. I do consider myself a Maritimer, being here 10 years. It has Alberta in the title of the book, but it's a book about the Maritimes. It really is. And so what it is she's working. First of all, she's the gender ratio is 1 to 50, so it's 1 woman to 50 men. So there's a lot of gender. I'm not even going to say politics. I'm just going to say abuse. And but there's a lot of most of the people working there are from the Maritimes because it's so poor in the Maritimes. That's where everyone has to go to get work, right? So she knows like Uncle Bob's buddy and Jimmy from down the road. Like all these people are working on the oil sands with her. So I would call that a masterpiece. So, but it's from a local, a local person who's done good, Kate Beaton. So that's one. Things that are just coming to my head. Okay, he's not Canadian, but a guy in France named David B, and he's part of an alternative movement in France that started a publishing company called L'Association, the association. Anyway, he did a book, a memoir about his brother, epileptic brother, in 3 volumes in French. It was collected in English in 1 volume called Epileptic. I would definitely call that a masterpiece. More recently, a guy from Chicago who's also being published by Drawn and Corley called Nick Dernasso. I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. He did, he just has a new book called Acting Class, which I haven't read. Was it called Beverly, or was that his first book? Sabrina. Well, one book was called Beverly, one book was called Sabrina. I can't remember anyway, one of those ones. It was nominated for the Man Booker Award. So the only graphic novel ever to be nominated for the most prestigious literary award. But that, I mean, it's very cold the way it's drawn, but it's just so brilliant. So yeah, it can be really cold, like stick figures, and still be a masterpiece, right? I mean, it doesn't have to be fancy. Okay, I'll give you a Conundrum Press artist. Nina Bunjevac is a Serbian artist from Toronto. So she has a very interesting backstory. So I published her first book called Heartless, which is a book of short stories, 10 years ago. And it's very dark, and it's like Yugoslavian avant-garde cinema. That's what it looks like. But incredibly detailed, technically brilliant drawing. But all the stories are really dark and cinematic, and it's just amazing stuff. So she was recognized in the States by all these kind of elder statesmen of the underground comics movement. So I came along and saw her work. I'm like, you should be published. You're Canadian. So I made this book of stories called Heartless. She went on to have a book called Fatherland published, and then another book called Benzema published by Fantagraphics. Fatherland was a graphic novel that expanded on one of the short stories in the book that I did. And it's all about, her father was a Serbian terrorist, and he blew himself up when Nina was a young girl. So it's sort of his story that fought, and about the sort of the nationalism of, and I'm telling this story only because like she tells it, right? It's not my story to tell, but I mean, this is what she writes about in her book. So everyone should go out and find Fatherland. And so that book, Heartless, she got an Italian edition, and she changed a lot of it and added all this new material. So she came to me and said, do you want to do a 10-year anniversary edition of this book? So we made a paperback edition that we're launching. It's out now. We're launching it next month at TCAF. And so she's in Toronto, so she'll be there. So I would have to mention Nina. So there you go. There's my Canadian conundrum artist. There are so many. They're all my babies.
No, I mean, I just wanted to give listeners an opportunity to go check out some Canadian artists that are doing some really cool.
Epileptic, Nina's, Heartless, Nick Dernasso, sure. Yeah, those are all very good, yeah.
You were looking at the records. You mentioned Bob Dylan.
Well, I just
huge influence on my creative.
Me too.
Path.
Yes, absolutely.
But talk a little bit about how music has played a role in your creative processes,
sure.
in your path as an artist, even when it comes to starting Conundrum Press and being a graphic novelist. Like,
sure.
What has music?
What
role has music played in that whole idea?
Well, yeah, Bob Dylan. I mean, as a writer, I appreciate songwriting, right? So Bob Dylan has to be mentioned in songwriting. Another person that is very influential, or was once I discovered his work, is Vic Chestnut. For me, very, very influential. It was funny. I was talking to my son, who's 14, in the car. I mean, they all listen to like Eminem and stuff. I'm like, hasn't there been somebody in the last 25 years like to come along? Like, this is from the 90s. You guys are listening to this stuff. I listened to this. And he's like, oh yeah. So we're talking about music and hip hop, and I was saying, yeah, for me it was all like Ice Cube and NWA, and I just went right to the hardcore. But he was like, oh well, what are you gonna talk about if he asks about music? What's your favorite album? And I was like, well, I don't know. When all that was going on, like all the grunge in the 91, I said 1991, Nevermind, Nirvana, which they're all listening to now, even at 14, and Death Certificate, Ice Cube came out that year, probably just before Eminem's first album. But, and I said, but I wasn't listening to that in the 90s. I was listening to jazz. Like I was listening to John Coltrane, Thelonious Monk, not as much Miles Davis, mostly Coltrane, Mingus, and Monk, I guess would be my three. And then a lot of spin-offs. And I would go to the Montreal Jazz Festival every year in July, and it would just be the most amazing thing because they'd have all these people that you would, you could pay your $100 a ticket and go see in the theater, but they're all playing for free on the street. Right. So I would just wander the streets with the crowds, and it'd just be this incredible music from all over the world. And every once in a while I'd have a friend that was on a side stage and we'd go see that. And that was a lot of fun. Then James Brown performed there. Right.
Oh, wow.
But there was 300,000 people on the street. So to me, that's not a good experience because I can't be around 300,000 people. Like I can barely around 3 anymore. So there was all that in Montreal. Yeah, so I was listening to a lot of jazz. So Vic Chestnut, I just recently, do you know that series of books called 33 and a Third? They're all like, they're very small, little square pocket books, and each one is a different album.
I don't know it, no.
Oh, you should know about this. So I discovered the publisher is now Bloomsbury, but there's 140 in the series, and they all look the same. It's like 1, 2, 3, 4. So, I have one about, so they're all different albums. And nowadays, I don't understand any of the albums. But, there's one on the Velvet Underground. There's probably one on one of Bob. There's Highway 61 Revisited. There's one on, Talking Heads I read. There's one on Led Zeppelin 4 I read. And it's all writers. And they not specifically like, okay, this song is broken down in these chords. They're not like writing as musicians. They're writing as like the cultural significance of the album. Like Liz Phair's Exile in Guyville. Is that the title of the album? Why her doing that album at that time, which was her first album, which was like, she was essentially like Exile on Main Street. She was taking this masterpiece by the Rolling Stones, and she's like, yeah, I'm 20-year-old girl, I'm a woman, I'm gonna just reinvent this. And people are like, you can't do that. And she's like, yeah, fuck you, I'm gonna do it. And so that's kind of what the book's about, right? More than breaking down the song structure. So I thought, I'm a writer, I'm trying to do more writing. So I pitched they have a call for submissions, so I pitched a book to them for this round, which was not accepted. But what was interesting was just the process of coming up with a proposal. So the album that I picked was called North Star Deserter by Vic Chestnut. And the significance for me of this album is Vic Chestnut. Do you know who Vic Chestnut is?
No.
Oh, really?
Really?
Oh, my God. It's like he's been called one of the top 5 singer-songwriters in America. So it's like him,
shows
Bruce
how much I know.
Springsteen, Bob Dylan. Sorry?
It shows how much I know.
Oh, come on. Well, I'll get you a Vic Chestnut album or two.
Yeah, that would be
But
great.
his story is he grew up in the Deep South, and he's, massive drunk and got a car accident, paralyzed. So he's in a wheelchair from age 19. And then he just started writing these really weird, so he's in Athens, Georgia, and he's discovered by Michael Stipe from REM. who sees him playing in a wheelchair. Like he has to duct tape a pick to his hand
Oh, wow.
because he can't move it. So he singer songwriting unbelievably good. So he can barely play the guitar, but you can just, that says something, right? If you can make this amazing music. Cowboy Junkies have done a whole album of his songs. So the Sweet Relief album came out to get a medical assistance or whatever in the 90s. So they did one for Victoria Williams, who's a good friend of his, which I also have. They did one for Vic Chestnut. I'm like, well, who's this Vic Chestnut guy? So I said, oh yeah, okay. And amazing songwriting. And then what happened was in 2007, he came to Montreal to like my local pub.
Oh, wow.
And which was being run by the guys from Godspeed You Black Emperor. And by that time it was just like different members and different groups and everything, all through this Constellation Records. Like that was the neighborhood, right? It was all these musicians, Constellation, like that was the music side. And so he came up and made an album with those musicians, and also Guy Piccolo, that's not his actual name, Fugazi, the guitar player from Fugazi, also came and joined them. And they made this album that it's like this Southern Gothic paraplegic singer-songwriter mixed with this like super underground droney prog rock acoustic orchestral noise, right? So it was just this incredible album. And so he made this album and then what happened was gentrification took over, and they made their own studio. So that was the last album to be recorded in that studio. Then he came back 2 years later. He made another album, which was less about the musicians and more about him. And then he committed suicide. So there's all of this stuff on these albums about, he's hinting at this sort of thing, and the fact that it was like the end, like the beginning of the end of an era, essentially at this record label, which is also very much like what you're doing or what I'm doing, but they're doing it with records. And so, they're very well respected community there. And anyway, so so there you go. There's some music that's influenced me. That was your question.
Wow. No, I'm
so it's
I'm
all
checking that
it's
out.
all in there.
So as far as Conundrum Press goes, are you currently looking for new talent?
I have a no submissions policy.
So how do you discover the artists?
I can
that you
discover
work
people. They just can't come to me.
with? Okay, so what would be some advice that you'd give to emerging graphic novelists on how to be discovered?
Make the thing first.
Make it first.
And then talk about it after.
Is
Have
social
something to
media the appropriate tool in which to deliver this type of content, or is there another way?
So I would say, yes, it's very specific advice I always give. And I don't know if anyone takes me up on it, but I'm going to give it again. There's a network of comic art festivals in North America and the world, really. But in Canada would be like the Toronto Comic Art Festival, the Dartmouth. There's one in Dartmouth at the ferry terminal every August. Dartmouth Comic Art Festival. There's zine fairs. Even the music festival, Sappy Fest in Sackville, has a zine fair attached to it. There's a Halifax zine fair. There's the Montreal Comic Art Festival. There's the Vancouver Comic Art Festival. There's zine, as I say, zine fairs and stuff. So there's a lot of these opportunities to sort of say, here's, some of them are more expensive than others. Some of them have sliding scales. So it's like $20 for a table, $50 for a table. You're a publisher, you pay more, but then you have artists come, whatever. But if you're not, you want to, my advice would be, make something, even if it's an 8-page comic or mini comic or something, zine, 16 pages, whatever. Make a couple of 8-pagers, make them black and white. Show whatever your idea is. Make something that shows that, even if it's a sampler right? And say, I want to do this 200-page graphic novel. Well, make a 10-page sampler so you have something to show, because you can't just talk about it, right? So do that, make it to the best of your ability, just staple it, pay your $20, have a table, show up, put your books down or whatever it is, buttons, pins, whatever you got, and, hope someone like me comes along and picks it up. And you might not sell anything. You might make your table costs back. You might not make your table costs back. I can guarantee you're going to meet like-minded people, whether they're making their own things or whether they're just interested in what you're doing. And if it's a thing where no one shows up, well, don't go back next year. Find a different one, because I guarantee you there's ones that you'll be seen at. So that's how I find people. I go to these, I would have a table at most of these places and then just walk around. And I've been able to do, I've kind of have done this long enough that I can tell by just glancing. I'll glance at 10 tables. I'll go to that one. That's the one I want to go to. I'll pay, because, I'm not going to say, hey, can I take a free thing? Because I want to give them actual currency. Like their work is valuable. Like there's value to what they're doing. Sometimes they say, well, I know you're Conundrum Press. I'm like, yeah, okay. And they're like, so I want you to have this as a submission. I'm like, okay, that's fine. So that can work. Or I just buy it because I'm interested. And every time I buy it, I say, are you Canadian? And if they say yes, I'm far more likely to buy it or take it away. I mean, if I really want it, I will just get it. Often they're American, right? Or European. And the second thing I'll say is your information. Like you have some way of contacting you in your email, Instagram link, something, right? So the best way is to make something, go to a bunch of these events, festivals, and you'll also be inspired by what you see on other people's tables, right?
For sure,
you'll if you're, I could have color covers. I could use risograph printing, or I could do this, or I could do that, and it'll just kind of be a stepladder, right? You got to start somewhere and give it away free. Like, do not be afraid to give stuff away free at the beginning, right? Yes, your time, your work has value. But if it isn't seen by anybody, it doesn't have value outside of you, right? So it's a stepladder, right? So you kind of got to start somewhere. And, I've been given free stuff before, and I'd like, okay, your email's in there. So I email them. I say, this is really great. Do you have more? Or I go to their website, or often I go to their Instagram. So that's the other thing. Make this thing, but also open up an Instagram page or something and throw some of the pages up and maybe something else that you've been doing, and have just, something about who you are. And then I would go to that and I'd say, oh, this person looks like they're doing really interesting stuff. And then I would email you and I'd say, or sometimes it says, I'm working on my graphic novel. So I'd email you, say you're working on a graphic novel on your website. So what's that about? Let's talk, right? So, but it's already because I'm interested in it. So, but I can't be interested in something that doesn't exist. And I sure as hell am not going to be interested in somebody coming up to me and saying, I have this idea.
Right.
Right? So no, that's not going to work. Or like I say, a lot of writers like, well, I've written this graphic novel. I say, well, can you draw? No. Okay. See you later,
Do you have any stories about artists that you've discovered, published, and distributed that have then gone on to do, global type enterprises? Like, would you consider Conundrum Press sort of like a Canadian talent incubator? Or I know you guys are global and everything, but like you mentioned that there's like obviously like bigger companies out there.
Yeah.
Are there people that you've worked with that have gone on to do like big things?
Yeah, certainly. But Nina Bunjevic is a good example. She's gone on, been very popular in Europe, and all her books are translated and stuff. Now sometimes there's artists that kind of go between, like sometimes, the bigger publisher will stop publishing them for whatever reason, and I'll step in, which is amazing. And then sometimes they go back. So an artist like Michelle Rebagliati is a good example of that, or David Collier is a good example of that, or Joe Ullman. And all these people have done books with other publishers that have done really well. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of times that happens, yeah, and it happens a lot more with the literary, like the novels and short stories, that world where there's a writer, they've written their first novel, and some small press publishes them and makes 1,000 copies, and it wins a big award, and then they get an agent, and then they get their $100,000 advance from a German conglomerate or whatever, right? So that happens a lot more. The thing about graphic novels is that there's no prizes, there are no big conglomerates doing that, right? So it's still very much they're in France, but here not, or obviously in Japan, but here not, and also in the States not so much. So it's so sometimes artists kind of go back and forth a little bit, but in terms of like international breakout, it doesn't happen really. The ones that do are like people like Drawn and Quarterly, like Kate Beaton, for example. She's on Canada Reads. It's a graphic novel on Canada Reads. Drawn and Quarterly publishes her book. I could have easily, as a Nova Scotian, published one of her first books, and then Drawn and Quarterly would have published this one on Canada Reads. Like that could have happened. It didn't. But she was on my radar and everything, obviously. But it isn't quite the same as, because there are no big multinationals in comics.
Are Canadian artists making a living off this, or are they?
They don't make a living
sort of...
off of their graphic novels. Some of them make a living off the spin-offs, which would be things like illustration jobs. A lot of them are illustrators that do, like, basically the advance I would pay for a graphic novel is what they would get paid for one illustration in the New York Times, right? So what are they going to do, right? So one is their bread and butter and, their job, and one is their creative vision. So
that was kind of where I was going. Is like,
yeah.
This type of art is almost like a musician that's not able to play live shows and make money off ticket sales. You're essentially only selling physical merchandise, and it's a difficult enterprise these days. So I was curious about that. If
sometimes there's other spin-offs like foreign rights, right? I mean, it depends. Workshops, speaking engagements, and universities are now really taking up a lot of this. So writers in residence, stuff like that. Like that's all starting to happen now for comics, where that didn't happen before. Like things that writers get paid to do now, comic artists are getting paid. Canada Council grants, for example, is a perfect example. So you could have gotten an arts grant as a comic artist before. In the last 5 or 6 years, they're funding graphic novels. So that's another way of making money too.
So there's a few people that I know on the West Coast that are into comic art and graphic novels. What can you say about what's happening out on that side of the country as opposed to out here?
Yeah, coast to coast. Well, yeah, Conundrum Press, one of the great things that has happened in the last 10 years is I now look at any given year, I'm publishing people from literally coast to coast to coast. So like last year there was like Dawson City, Victoria, Yellowknife, Nova Scotia, Toronto, Montreal, Winnipeg. Now there's like 4 artists in a row from Edmonton. Like, what's going on in Edmonton? I don't know. Something's going on. But on the West Coast, so I grew up in Vancouver, so I still have roots there, but I was never really involved in an arts community. So when I was growing up, it was very much like DOA was kind of the punk band. That was the extent of our culture. So yeah, with the comics out there, so I publish a few artists. Sonia Ehlers is in Victoria, who's been doing amazing work for a long time. And she's she has a show coming up, I should plug this, at the Richmond Art Gallery, so in Richmond, the suburb of Vancouver, called Classification Crisis. So this is a term used in archival work. So it's an art show of her archives. And as part of those archives, she makes these, she made in the 90s, where I discovered her work, she made these zines that she was one of the first people that I saw had like zines that had a spine. I'm like, oh, it's a book. It's not a zine. It's a book of zines. What is this? Like, it's a classification crisis. What do you call it? It's not a graphic novel. So she came to me last year, a couple years ago, and she had the third in a trilogy of this work. So I published it. It's called Swan Song. I don't think I brought one over here. So she's in Victoria, and so I'm gonna distribute the catalog to this gallery show, which is done, and I've seen it. It's pretty amazing. Not the show. I've seen the book, the catalog, because it has to get printed. So I'll be doing that. So everyone should go. I think it's in September. Classification Crisis, Richmond Art Gallery, Sonia Ehlers. The other big thing at the end of May, let me get the date. It's the May 21st weekend at the Roundhouse in downtown Vancouver is VanCaf, so the Vancouver Comic Art Festival, which was started by a guy, Robin McConnell, who did a comics podcast actually at off the UBC radio station, CKUT. Or is that the Montreal one? Anyway, the UBC one. So I published a book of some of the interviews that he did. He did like 500 interviews. So he started this festival. Other people have since taken it over. But what happened was the Toronto Comic Art Festival, which has been going for 20 years, which is at the library in Toronto, basically had set up this model for how to run these comic art festivals really successfully. And the Vancouver one just said, come consulting. And so they basically use that model for the Vancouver one, and it has just become a really great, exceptional show. So anyone on the West Coast I'll be there with Conundrum Press. I'm going to fly out just for that weekend. And it's in the Roundhouse. So, I mean, it's a beautiful old train station in Vancouver. So how can you go wrong? And and anyone making stuff, I mean, it's too late to get a table, but go around. If you're actually interested in making work, go around. Like, go to this event, go around, buy up some stuff, talk to people, see what they're making. I mean, obviously people want to chat about their own work, right? And get some inspired ideas and talk to me, talk to publishers. I'll be there, and give me stuff for free.
Give me stuff.
So that's, and then the other, a couple other artists I published for Vancouver, Sean Caramaker, who I'm not sure what he's doing right now. I think he's moved into virtual reality games and things. He did a book called Feast of Fields. I'm going to be launching actually at VanCaf a legendary figure in the mini comics community in Vancouver called Colin Upton. So I have collected one sort of branch of those mini comics, about 10 issues of one small autobiographical branch of thousands of mini comics, into a book called Postmodern Mini Comics. So we'll be launching that at VanCaf. And the other major conundrum artist in Vancouver would be Cole Pauls, who's he's an Indigenous artist from the he's Tatlan, so the language is Southern Tachoni. It's in the Yukon. I can't pronounce the name of the nation he's from. Anyway, he went to Emily Carr. In fact, it's funny because his origin story, the reason he started doing zines was because he saw one of the book of zines, one of these books that I collected of zines. At age 14, he came off of his community in the Yukon to Dawson City, and one of my friends was teaching there and gave him one of my books, and the rest of his life, he changed his life because he's like, I can make these zines, so he's making zines. And so he'll be there, and he's also going to be he's a guest in Toronto and in Montreal and in Vancouver, but he lives in Vancouver, so so those are all the West Coast connection. Well, there's others.
Is there any other major events in the next few months or over the next year that you'd like to mention that Conundrum Press is going to be involved with?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is the big push is May, basically every year. So it's the Toronto Comic Art Festival is April 30th, that weekend. That is the number one event in my calendar, and I will be there with a bunch of people signing, and all the new books will get launched. Nina Bunjevac will be there. Cole Pauls will be there, of the people I've mentioned today, among many others. Then the 2 weeks later is the Vancouver Festival. And a week after that is it's officially called the Festival Bande Dessinée de Montréal, which so it's been a French festival in the east side of Montreal that's been going for a long time. And I started going there, but I was kind of hassled as an Anglophone. And I said, fuck this, I'm not going back. And recently they moved it onto the street on Saint Denis, and they have new people running it. And they're really like, we really want Anglophones. Like, we want to bring everyone together. It's all good. And I'm like, you might, but the people on the street might not, right? So I went, I said, okay, I'll give it a try. It's this new model. And last year it was just super successful. So it looks like that's going to be a big thing going forward. And then I founded an event because in Montreal in the 90s, we didn't have any zine fairs. So we started something called Expozine. So I was one of the founders of that. And that is still going 25 years later. So it's in a church basement every November. And that started out as 80% Anglo, 20% Franco. And now it's 80% Franco and 20% Anglo. So I always go to that one in November in Montreal. And now, every literary festival, like the Afterwards Festival in Halifax, has its token Graphica event. So often I try to get in on those, and we'll have like the Fry Festival in Moncton has two of our authors this year in April. Coast to coast.
Coast to coast.
Yeah.
How can people connect with Conundrum Press or check out what you guys are doing, keep up to date? Maybe plug your website and your social media before we call it a day.
Yeah, I mean, we have a new website, so they just basically go to the website and it all will be revealed. www.conundrumpress.com.
Easy.
Pretty basic stuff, yeah. Just Google Conundrum Press. I should warn you, there are two Conundrum Presses. So if you find yourself looking at poetry from Denver, Colorado, you're on the wrong Conundrum Press.
Conundrumpress.com.
.com. Yes.
The other one must have a different extension.
I'm not. They definitely, no, they do. I think the social media stuff. Anyway, they're poetry press from Denver. There's a very funny story. Do you remember a film called Sideways? It was about all set in the Napa Valley wineries. It became like this darling indie thing. Paul Giacometti played a really
I don't
anyway, he's a really grumpy writer, and they go on a wine tour in the Napa Valley, and everything falls apart, and his life is falling apart. But at the beginning of it, he's like, I submitted my manuscript to Conundrum Press, and I'm waiting to see. And so they go on this trip, and then he finds out he gets rejected, and his life's over. And
was that you?
So I had this phone call from a Hollywood producer before any of this happened, and they're just like, and we played a bit of phone tag, and they're like, yeah, we need permission to use Conundrum Press in our big movie. And I'm just like, really? Like some small thing. And then I find out that this is what it was for. And it was like this Academy Award nominated film. Wow. So I had all these people calling me up like, oh, can you sue them? Can you sue them? I don't think it led to a single sale of a book, frankly. But what happened was, so we played phone tag, and then I eventually got in contact with them, and they said, oh, we got permission from the other Conundrum Press. And I said, oh, did I miss out on some money? And they're like, no, we would have just changed the name. Anyway, that's my story about the other. That's my connection to the other Conundrum Press.
All right, everybody. Thank you for listening. Andy Brown.
Thank you, everyone.
Founder of Conundrum Press. Check out www.conundrumpress.com for more info.
Yes.
And Andy, thanks so much for coming to chat tonight.
Well, thanks for
really
asking
informative.
Me. Now you're in the hood.
In the hood.
You're in the hood.
All right, everybody. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time. This is Surkeus Records, the podcast. Have a good night.